You want to know something funny? 17 years Meet the Sniper has been out, not a single video on this topic. That really surprised me when I started doing research for this video, as we've all been led to believe by this man who has the spatial awareness of a badger with a tyre track down the middle of his head, that sniping is in fact a good job, mate. So join me today as we attempt to question the previous 17 years worth of throwaway meme catchphrases, as we answer the question of is sniping actually a good job? Mate, I forgot the mate. So the entire gimmick and question we're answering in this video centre around the specific kind of sniper that Sniper is. Saying you're a sniper is a bit like saying you're a gender studies student. It's not very specific, and no one's ever going to hire you for a normal job. Now I know what you might be thinking. Quador, these are all mercenaries. They label themselves as mercenaries. Even the company they work for labels them as mercenaries. And to that I say, first of all, shut up and have some patience. And second, you're right. Sort of. Obviously we're going to get into some real world sniping stuff pretty soon. And with me being an Englishman, and with you being somewhere between the ages of 13 and 18, neither of us are exactly experts on shooting people in deserts. So I've done my best to do the research I can, and from what I understand, Sniper's job falls somewhere between the lines of mercenary and what's known as a security contractor. Now, on the surface, these two roles in sniping are basically the same thing. In fact, the biggest difference between them is just branding, but the further back you go down the family tree, the more important differences you start to notice. Mercenaries are essentially just hired to kill for money. They're soldiers of fortune rather than unfortunate soldiers. They're about as loyal as iDubbbz's girlfriend, and when the money runs out, they're gone. Mercenaries had it pretty good until the 70s, when more and more countries started to sign anti-mercenary laws. Essentially, mercenaries were given the same duties and respect as soldiers, except without any of the standards to uphold. This even includes an amendment to the Geneva Convention in 1977, when mercenaries were taken from soldiers to civilians or criminals, which I personally find quite funny, as that's around the time the TF2 story would cash in for an early retirement, so maybe there's a connection there. The death of the mercenary combined with the clever studying of some legal loopholes would give rise to something known as a PMC, or Private Military Company. Private military companies at a foundational level operate quite similarly to the likes of mercenaries, but with some major differences the further up you go. Quite a lot of PMCs are US based, and they're mostly just hired muscle rather than hired gun. The usual things PMCs are hired to do include the likes of driving trucks in green zones or safe zones, bolstering the forces of underpowered state militaries, VIP protection and escorting, or the likes of proper combat work, although that's not very common. PMCs had their golden years in the 90s and mid to late 2000s, when a lot of Middle East based conflict involved the US. They're still around today, but thanks to most militaries being a lot stronger, they operate on a much smaller scale. From what I understand, the majority of PMC work these days is mostly just bodyguarding. Companies like this grow and hire in times of conflict, so it's probably not the worst time in the world to join a PMC if you are interested. Although you are probably going to need an extensive military background, so, you know, good luck. Circling all the way back to what I said earlier though, if you work for a PMC, you are either a private military contractor or you are known as a security contractor, which is where Sniper becomes relevant again. PMCs, mercenaries, real-world laws, yada yada yada, how does this blend into TF2? Well, it blends in just like this. Our mercenaries don't technically work for Red and Blue, they work for a company called TF Industries. TF Industries is the big overarching company that controls pretty much everything we interact with in the game. They are a huge company specialising in everything from munitions distribution to mercenary hiring, and they have many smaller divisions to them, such as Manco and Red and Blue, and also apparently a board games company, but ignore that one. Point being, all of these companies are technically part of the same larger company, and so whilst our mercs are hired to work for Red and Blue, they're technically employed by TF Industries. I imagine to about 89% of the people watching this, everything I just said was completely insane. But I'd like to remind you that I've now been playing TF2 for 10 years, so I technically have TF2 tenure, so now I know everything there is to know about the game, and also I read this comic. Yeah, the world of TF2 was relatively flat until the final comic came along, but I'm actually quite happy with the position it left both our characters and the story in, and it expanded the world in a really natural way, a way I thought was actually quite fitting and tied up quite a few loose ends. So where am I going with all of this? Where I'm going with this is that TF Industries, whilst not exclusively being a mercenary company, definitely has a mercenary division. Back in the 60s and 70s when this game takes place, this would have been known as a mercenary division. However, if a company were operating like this in the modern day, it would probably have rebranded to a PMC. The question we're proposing in this video is not, is sniping a good job in the 60s and 70s, it's is sniping a good job in the modern day. And so, for the sake of argument, we are going to consider Sniper a security contractor and say he works for a private military company. With that, we can now bleed into the next category of this video, the day-to-day workings of your average security contractor. I've got to say off the front that most of what I'm going to be referencing in this segment has come from personal anecdotes of those who have worked for private militaries. I feel this is probably the best way to get an answer for what it's really like to be a sniper in this kind of situation, and also because understanding contracts is hard and it's probably easy to learn from the people who work with them rather than the actual contract itself. So we'll cover all of the basic aspects of what the job might entail, such as the day-to-day working life, living conditions, pay, responsibilities, and dangers before I give my own personal concluding thoughts on whether I think sniping is a good job, mate. But before that, YouTube wants to tell you to subscribe or else they're going to cut my ears off, so please subscribe, I need those to listen to Fetty Wap. I also want to note that in the initial draft of this script, I was going to tell a fictional story at the end of this section, going over what an average 30 days of working as a contractor sniper might look like. But writing a fictional story based on real-world tragedies and dragging byleth PNGs around an Illustrator file probably isn't the best way to tell a story. Don't get me wrong, I'm not someone who becomes hand-flappy whenever war is mentioned, but the real world is a lot more complex than any story I could possibly tell, so let's leave it at that. So what does the average working day for a sniper contractor look like? Well, to start off, it's not really a working day. Security contractors are on a rotational schedule basis, a bit like oil rig workers. They typically spend X amount of weeks on the job and then X amount of weeks off. Predictable, as here in the West anyway, they typically work overseas. From gleaming the various interviews I could find, it seems typical working schedules usually fall anywhere between the lines of 30 days on, 30 days off, 60 days on, 60 days off, 60 days on, 30 days off, and 90 days on, 30 days off. The specifics of which are entirely dependent on the contract you sign, which is entirely dependent on the kind of work you're conducting. Now, pure snipers aren't particularly common in the world of security contracting, as you'll typically want someone who can do a little bit of everything. But if you are the designated sniper on a team, what kinds of work might you be getting? Well, probably the two most common types of work you'll be getting are construction-based protection or VIP escort and protection. Construction-based protection might sound a bit strange, but let's say you're working in a country where there are lots of dangerous gangs or maybe terrorist organizations, but still infrastructure must continue. The government of this country might hire you out to protect the builders whilst they work on their project. And then VIP escorting is exactly how it sounds. Maybe there's a minister or a politician in a foreign country and you've been hired to escort him from A to B, or maybe watch over his entire political journey overseas. In these circumstances, a sniper is mostly going to be conducting something known as Overwatch. No, I'm not kidding. And in case you're wondering, no, that's no coincidence. The name Overwatch, as in the game, actually comes from this military term. Overwatch is conducting reconnaissance from an vantage point, looking out for your team, maybe potentially pointing out anything or anyone of interest, or it's that exact same thing except you're neutralizing anyone who's potentially dangerous now, in a few seconds time, or later. So far, lots of sticks, not very many carrots. So why would someone go into this field of sniping? Well, there are two main reasons why. The first one is obvious. The money. A bad contract could have you on $50 a day, a decent contract could have you on $200 a day, and anything above $300 to $700 is absolutely fantastic. This kind of job pays really well, one because many people consider it undesirable, and two because you really have to be the right kind of person to pack up shop for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days at a time. You're basically going to live and die by your work, as you're just not going to have the time for social interactions long term when you're back home. But many people are willing to make that trade for money. And the second reason someone might go into this kind of work is simply because nothing else suits them. When you come out of the military, civilian street just really isn't your kind of thing. You have very high skills, very specific qualifications that just don't blend well with natural life. So why not just throw yourself back into the fray under a new set of rules? On the topic of rules though, let's talk a little bit about the working conditions, the living conditions, and the military. My main sources of information for this come from two different places, that being the US-involved conflict in Iraq in the early 2000s, and the Russian-Ukraine war going on today. So PMCs and security contractors work very closely with the local designated militaries, and the military utterly despises security contractors most of the time. This isn't true for every military and every PMC out there, but usually they are viewed as a necessary evil. And to be fair, why wouldn't you if you're in that position? In comes some soldiers, nowhere near as trained as you, nowhere near as professional, yet they do do half the work, are allowed to drink, make truckloads more money than you do, and ultimately don't have the same level of responsibility as you, even though when they mess up it still damages your reputation. This is especially true for the US-Iraq conflict I mentioned earlier, and less so for the Russian-Ukrainian. But to be fair, when you're hiring out Blackwater to work alongside with you, often considered one of, if not the most evil PMCs to ever exist, then yeah, I think their reputation's pretty valid. So as a contractor sniper, you'd be working, training, performing weapon maintenance, practice drills, and living very closely alongside with the military. The living conditions will normally be one of two things. They will either be a smaller, designated part of said military campus for you and your team, or you might invade a home that's close to the front lines but still defensible, kick out the occupants living in it, and essentially run it as your base. Yeah, that's real, by the way. This is very common in conflict where the front lines could spread quite far, like with the previous Iraq-US mentioned conflict. In situations like this, it's probably a good idea to have a few different bases in a few different places, and no one ever said war was going to be peaceful for the civilians. The final thing I have to mention about this job is, well, it's the obvious one. This is a killing job. It really doesn't matter how many levels of duty or honor or self-righteousness you want to coat things in. At the end of the day, on your working shift, at any point in your working shift, you're going to have to be prepared to trade someone else's life in for coin. Coin that when you die is ultimately meaningless. For some people, this is completely fine as they believe the cause they are serving is worth greater than this. But as you can imagine, for most people, not quite their cup of tea. All of this is completely forgetting that some people can say they're fine doing this, but when they're actually thrown into a life and death situation, their opinion might change quite quickly. Or it might not even be something they have the time to change to begin with. I promise you this entire video is not an attempt at a YouTuber to draw something out for ad revenue, as everything we've discussed leading up to this moment is entirely consequential for the answer I'm about to give. So with all of the previous 11 minutes and 30 seconds worth of evidence in hand, do I actually think sniping is a good job, mate? No. No, of course I don't. Yeah, I really don't know what to say if you didn't see this one coming. When researching this video, I went in with a blank mind as I really wanted to answer this question for myself, and I was fully dedicated to at least giving you an opinionated answer from myself, rather than doing the typical video essay thing of saying, well, it entirely depends on whether you think it's good or not. No, I don't think sniping's a very good job, mate, and I don't think very many people would say it is either, but it definitely is a good job and even the right job for some people. And bear in mind, we've only discussed security contractor sniping, which is closest to what sniper actually does. We haven't even discussed the broader scopes of military or law enforcement / SWAT sniping, and if we did, just including those three alone, this video would be 40 minutes long. So in the event that you're unsatisfied with this answer, I encourage you to do your own research, and also if you either are or happen to know someone who is a security contractor, I'm more than happy to pin a comment correcting any mistakes I made. Now that's actually it for the main bulk of the video, so if you are only interested in the topic at hand, cheers for stopping by, there's no harm in clicking off now. But if you're interested in both a channel update and a wider TF2 community as a whole update, which sounds a bit weird, then I've got a few extra things I want to say before I cut the video off. So the first one is a personal channel update. TF2 is not going anywhere. The last 5 videos I put out were all Marvel Rivals videos, and 3 of them even did better than most of the TF2 videos I released in 2025. But that doesn't mean I've completely abandoned TF2. But I just want to say, whilst TF2 content is still coming down the line, if you do enjoy my style of video, then these are the exact same videos with the exact same jokes, but just featuring a different bunch of arseholes. And the second thing is the more worrying sounding one, which is the larger TF2 community update thing. So you might have noticed currently that there is a huge TF2 content drought. There just really aren't a lot of TF2 videos being made at the moment. This is something I've been discussing with Lucid on his podcasts. I've spoken to enough of the names in the sphere to understand right now that your favourite TF2 content creator probably just isn't playing the game at the moment. And that's because, currently anyway, there really just isn't a lot to talk about. I think everyone is just waiting for this big MVM update to drop, which I predict will probably be dropping around April. So I just really wanted to say that no, TF2 is not dying, and no, the community is not dying, but in terms of content, now's not the worst idea to support your favourite creator in any other kinds of videos they might want to make, and expect a whole new wave of TF2 content and content creators to come when the MVM update eventually drops. But until that day comes, my name has been Lon'qudor, he made a baby, and turns out sniping isn't actually a good job, mate.